Welcome to Chapter 1. In this chapter, we will cover 4 ideas. First, we will study what models of communication are. Second, we will define nonverbal communication. Third, we will consider types of nonverbal communication primacy. Fourth, we will learn about nonverbal communication channels. The linear model of communication is one of the most widely known models of communication. It was devised by the scholars Shannon and Weaver. This model explains how a verbal, or nonverbal, message is transmitted to another person or persons. The linear model starts with the person who originates the message. This person is called the sender. The sender encodes his or her thoughts into a specific message. After encoding the message, the sender will then convey the message through a channel. Channels are ways of transmitting a message like a phone call or a written document or even a gesture. In the previous slide, we learned about the role played by the sender. Who does the sender transmit the message? That's right, the message is intended for the receiver. A receiver is the target person to whom the message is directed. The receiver begins decoding the message once he or she has received it. Decoding refers to the process of understanding the meaning of the message and the intent of the sender. Context is the setting in which communication occurs, the time and social situation wherein messaging happen. It is important to note that both the creation and the transmission of a message are influenced by the setting. For example, Evan may be interested in sending a funny meme to his best friend when he's in church on Sunday morning. However, because of the emotional experience that he's having or because of his inability to get to his cell phone without offending the other congregants around him, he might not send it. Noise is any barrier to hearing or understanding that detracts from the successful transmission of a message. It will be harder for a receiver to successfully decode the message that a sender has encoded if there is more noise present in a communication context. Let's consider several types of noise. Physical noise refers to any physical sound that stops you from perceiving a message. For example, say you are in a building and there is construction taking place outside. The sound that is generated from the construction is physical noise that can make it harder for you to hear. Psychological noise refers to a mental state that distracts someone from correctly understanding a message. For example, you might be talking with your friend about a recent event, but your friend is thinking about where to go for dinner. Physiological noise is the third type of noise. This type of noise happens when a receiver's physical state like hunger or sleepiness interrupts his or her ability to decode a message. The fourth type of noise is semantic noise. This noise refers to a situation where individuals don't understand the symbols that are being used in the message due to unfamiliar words or pronunciations. While the linear model of communication provides us with a simple idea of how people communicate, we know that human communication does not always happen that way. In fact, human communication is much more complicated. Therefore, the transactional model of communication offers a more realistic representation of how you and I typically engage in human communication. The transactional model of communication captures our understanding of this back and forth between people. It happens in situations in which people send messages at the same time to each other. Throughout the interaction, each person serves as both a sender and a receiver of messages. The transactional model of communication also introduces the concept of feedback. Feedback refers to the verbal and/or nonverbal responses that someone gives in reaction to a message that they are receiving. For example, the receiver may nod or say aha to indicate that he or she hears or agrees with the sender. Feedback is also a set of responses that influences future messaging, because feedback may encourage the sender to continue speaking on the message or to change how he or she might present the message. Recall the scenario from the textbook, Adam's funny facial expressions, of Brooke adapt her messaging on the fly, when they were discussing dinner. Finally, we should note that feedback is a move away from the simple unidirectional messaging where individuals take turns to be the sender and the receiver. We have so far considered the process of verbal communication through the linear model and the transactional model. Words are important as the verbal content of the message can have a critical impact on the people, places, and things with which we interact or engage. It is therefore important that we ensure that the words we use convey the messages that we hope they convey. However, what we don't say is equally important. Nonverbal messages can have a strong impact within an environment. So, what is nonverbal communication? Nonverbal communication is messaging without using verbal language. Nonverbal communication is any communicative characteristic, or behavior, that intentionally or unintentionally conveys a message without the use of verbal language. Words or behaviors that directly stand for a specific word or words would be included in verbal language. For example, extending one's middle finger in the direction of another person is an offensive gesture. People of the larger North American culture clearly understand what words go alongside such a gesture. However, The gesture may convey a different meaning among close friends when one winks while performing the gesture. In this context, the gesture may imply humor and friendship rather than animosity. Therefore, the gesture itself is verbal communication as it is considered formal language. When is nonverbal communication intended? Well, nonverbal communication can be either intentional or unintentional. That is because we tend to send messages to others even when we don't intend to be doing so, and thus are not always aware of our communicative behaviors. Applying what we have learned from the previous slide, would American Sign Language, or ASL, be considered as nonverbal? Actually, sign language is a form of verbal communication. It is a system of language communicated through gestures. Hand gestures and facial expressions are combined to send specific and discrete language-based messages, even though no words are audibly spoken. It is important to note that verbal communication does not necessarily must contain vocal or auditory messages. We can use verbal communication to visually send messages through the written word or through the interpretation of specific gestures used in sign language. Thus, for verbal communication, there is a verbal meaning attached to each sign. The signs are considered verbal communication because each sign has a direct verbal meaning attached to the sign. In other words, the way languages are formed and acquired throughout a culture, each meaning is codified and made formal. For example, Sarah, who is deaf, may try to point to items on the menu or mime certain types of food when she orders food at a restaurant. However, if she finds a restaurant that uses ASL, she can simply sign the items that she wants. We will now turn our attention to consider the importance of nonverbal communication primacy. We describe nonverbal communication as having primacy because nonverbal communication represents many important firsts in human interactions. That means that we typically pay attention to nonverbal messages first when we interact with others. Ontogenetic primacy is the idea that nonverbal communication comes before any other form of communication in each individual experience. It is the earliest type of communication for our human species as well. Consider how infants communicate. Because they haven't yet acquired a verbal language system, infants have to communicate with other humans nonverbally from the moment of birth. Communication of their needs through crying and receiving help from a caretaker is usually done by infants. Love and affection are received without the infants understanding formal language. During those early interactions, basic emotions like contentedness are still able to be communicated. When infants become small children, interaction entails sound, touching, being touched, eye contact, and other forms of auditory communication and affection. Positive affirmations are given to small children for those early attempts at communicating. For example, a child cries to indicate hunger to his mother. The mother and child will make eye contact, assuming that the mother breastfeeds her child. Thus, an early form of touch expression are the grasping and kneading behaviors of the child. In summary, children quickly learn that verbal language allows for greater specificity in achieving their goals. Greater urgency is conveyed by nonverbal forms of expression like crying or a tantrum. In their own lifespan, it is each person's earliest form of communication. Therefore, nonverbal communication is the way that one communicated throughout the earliest interactions, whether happy or not. Long before modern humans were around, nonverbal messaging was used by our ancestors to communicate. Each individual human has explored his or her social world through nonverbal messaging. That brings us to interactional primacy, which highlights how each time we interact with someone, we exhibit a common form of primacy as we pay attention to their nonverbal behaviors. We do that before we consider any words that they might be using. Therefore, first impressions are often based on nonverbal characteristics and behaviors of another person. First impressions and observation are based upon a variety of different things observed and evaluated by each person. Examples include seeing the facial expressions of a coworker, feeling a best friend's affectionate touch, smelling a romantic partner's cologne, hearing a child's heartbeat during a long embrace, and taste, although there are no direct nonverbal codes for taste. While we have so far considered possible nonverbal messages through face-to-face communication channels, there are also nonverbal messages transmitted through mediated channels and communication such as phone conversations, text messages, emails, and radio. Another useful source of nonverbal messages is the vocal characteristics of the speaker. Vocal characteristics are nonverbal indicators of the speaker's emotional state. When we watch television programs and films, we observe rich expression of the actor's nonverbal messages but lose interactivity of actual interactions. And finally, there are emoticons and emojis. These text-based images or graphics that replicate facial expressions or other visual cues are proxies for nonverbal communication. The characteristics of the communication channels have been looked at more intentionally, as scholars try to determine which channels are most important for communicating a full range of messages. To determine the importance of channels, we should consider three factors. The first factor is channel reliance. This factor refers to the tendency of humans to rely on specific channels for specific types of messages. For example, there are times when it is better to deliver bad news in person. The second factor to consider is the impact on the intended message. That refers to the interactivity of the chosen channel type, and if that level of interactivity is desired for the message. The third factor is the influence on attention, or the nonverbal characteristics that the receiver pays attention to in relation to the extent that the receiver can engage with the sender.